Hello and welcome or welcome back, BookTube, to Read Becca for a little bit of a discussion of a trilogy that I read and really enjoyed. That is the Founders Trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is obviously Locklands, which is the third book in the trilogy. It's made up of Foundryside, Shorefall, and Locklands. And they all have this glorious cover art. I adore it because it's very high impact and contrast with a kind of iconic items around it, but then we have really beautiful figure painting in the middle, and they're just really beautiful as objects. I also had previously read Foundryside, the first book, a couple of years ago in print, and so on the reread of that book, I decided to audiobook it before jumping into completing the whole trilogy. And the audio narration is so impeccable. It's by Tara Sand, who is an audio not just a narrator, but a voice actress who does anime and cartoons, and she did characterization throughout the series so well. So from a kind of all-around perspective, this is just such a great series as objects, as audio. The whole experience was just wonderful for me. So in terms of the actual story, let me put this down quickly. We're in this very high fantasy secondary world setting that's clearly inspired by Italy and Venice specifically, and you can tell that from sort of the terminology used and naming conventions, that sort of thing. But it's also got sort of a technological element to it because it's a hard fantasy sort of setup where we're really getting into how the magic works almost to a scientific level, to the point where they're advancing simple items through this scribing magic that's writing runes on these items that are tied back to a lexicon that tells them how to work. And in doing so, they can change how things work. So they can take a simple item and really advance it technologically through this magic. So it definitely has those vibes. For me, this is easily comparable to a mix between Mistborn, which has that vibe of really hard magic system, and a crew is a very core element to this. So that has the character crew is really integral to both of those, as well as Scott Lynch's Gentlemen Bastards series. So that also has those crew vibes, that kind of pseudo-Italian setting, and some of the power dynamics I think are similar there. Where here we're following a character, Sancha, who is a thief, similar to our Gentlemen Bastards. She's very snarky, and she has some certain things about her that are very special, particularly that she can hear items that are scribed. So that gives her this special skill set for her thieving. And naturally, at the very beginning of this, she is hired to steal something that she probably shouldn't have her hands on, and things go awry, the item ends up in her possession, and everything sort of goes from there, with this item being very unique and special and her being on the run as a result to some degree. Then we have completely the flip side, where we have this character, Gregor, who is a member of powerful families in this city who doesn't really want to be part of the powerful families in the city. He wants to clean up the problems and maybe help things out by starting law enforcement. So he's effectively on the opposite side of the law from Sancha. And so these two are in conflict. They wind up having lots of run-ins together about this. Eventually they end up kind of working toward the same aims, grudgingly together. And so that's sort of the start of our crew, I would really say, is that they build these other skilled individuals around them. As in Foundryside, we're at a very city level. It's a story of rising against and wanting to overthrow a system of oppression in the city. Because the city setup here is that we have this powerful magic that's derived from someone owning a central lexicon that tells this magic how to work, and only the wealthy elites can have that, really, in the way that the power structure works. So they've built up these guild houses, and these guild houses have all of the power. And so Sancha, as a thief, is outside of that. She has no part. She can't even get in the gates to these guild houses other than by breaking in. And so these guild houses have created a system of oppression and inequality, a class divide between those who have and those who have not. And I think that is a powerful element of the story here that runs all the way through the trilogy. It's extremely about systemic inequality. To the point, I would definitely say that this is looking at anti-capitalism and anti-corporatism. There's a lot to do with collective action here, and even potentially workers' unions at parts in the story, which is not something I've really seen in high fantasy before. So really intriguing elements, and I do think that's something that Robert Jackson Bennett, I've heard, touches on in other books of his. So I will be very curious to see how that's addressed elsewhere. So that clearly, reaches out to me because that's something I'm always interested in hearing takes on. And I think this explored that very well. So that's, for the most part, the first book thematically. I'm not going to talk very much about books 2 or 3 because we're way into spoilers once you get into those. The stories of books 1, 2, and 3 are very consecutive. There are short time jumps between the books, but for me, I rarely read books back to back, and I am so glad that this series is one I especially did select to do that, not knowing, because it does pretty much just dive right in. We've had some pretty major discoveries toward the end of book 1 in terms of how this magic works, and diving into book 2, the beginning of the book 2 is immediately going into exploring those discoveries. So it's very much about that. Jumping off from that point of these magical discoveries, we're in a society at the point of this story that has really regressed, and they view these founders, these ancient founders, as people who were almost godlike in terms of the power that they had through scribing. It's beyond what they can even imagine being able to do. And so they've regressed so much that they really have a rudimentary understanding of this magic. And so they are trying to tap into, over the course of this series, the founders' magic and the knowledge of the founders. And so the course of this increasingly grows in stakes beyond the city. It increasingly grows in that almost we're going through an industrial revolution over the course of the trilogy to expand magic and their magical technology so much that they are continually, exponentially going through growth. By the end, they're doing some very, very cool things with the magic. That's not really something I've seen in high fantasy very much before. And this is doing so much in terms of fresh ideas, and innovation is a huge element of this. There's something that keeps coming up throughout the story where they do talk about you have to throw yourself off a building and build your wings as you fall. So they are very focused on fly by the seat of your pants type innovation. And there are some moments where I feel maybe that could be hand wavy, where they conveniently solve a problem, but it's always logical. They come up with a magical solution to things in the moment when they need it. But the problem solving is there for sure. It's not them just hand waving things away, in my perspective. So I thought that was such a strong element of really having this science-like magic that they really are able to apply logic to. Beyond just the magic, the world building is so well done here that even though in book 1 you were extremely centered on this, as I said, very like Venetian inspired city, and you're almost wholly there, you get glimpses of backstory elsewhere. Once things do finally start expanding out, you have a sense of it having always been there. It seems fully fleshed out from even before. Like, you know of places that were mentioned. You have an understanding of there being other cultures in this world even before you're ever exposed to kind of things that are going on elsewhere or in the past. So I think that was so well done, how you have a really vivid sense of the place and it being more than just what you're seeing. In terms of the characters, that's really the shining star of this story. If you're not getting along with the characters early on, you probably are not going to enjoy this series. I think for me, meeting Sancha as a character right off, I adored her. She is very snarky and headstrong. She is a fully formed person in my mind. She has such great banter with many of the characters, and I don't really want to spoiler anything. This happens so early that many people do talk about this in their reviews, but the item she steals turns out to have this fully formed personality. So Sancha, as this special person who can hear items, she now can hear this item and it can hear her. And so they actually have these, conversations in her head. So that's one of my favorite tropes, the sort of voice in the head. I love that in fantasy. So that's my absolute catnip. Obviously, I'm going to love that executed here. And that does play out in this story. The two characters, Sancha and Clef, this item, are just such a great dynamic duo. And then the two of them being sort of completely on board with each other and very quirky characters against Gregor, who's very serious and very serious in state. And he's stuck sort of with them on Sancha's team, working toward the goal that they share. And then they pull in these other, specialized, skilled people to help them in their crew. And this crew becomes a found family. And that's just so comforting in a gritty, dark, oppressive world where, they all have to band together to get where they're going, is really such a key element of this series. Throughout the series, it is done so well that people are antagonistic toward each other or are outright villains. And frequently we have to see why they do what they do, that maybe they have the right reasons for doing what they're doing, but what they're doing is dehumanizing to others or is actively harmful to others, but they think they're doing it for the right reason. And so this isn't full-on grimdark, I don't think, in that we usually still know who's good and who's evil, but it definitely has a strong vein of empathy. And I think that's probably one of the biggest points for me of this whole series, is that as we go along, especially as we head toward the big moments at the end of the book, as the stakes get higher and more epic, we are seeing them fix things and problem solve through empathy. It's such a major element as the book goes along. So I love that's really leaned on in this story, that having empathy for why other people are doing what they're doing is a problem solving tool, really. So I love that. I love that we do see people join forces with people they disagree with very often through this story, rather than it being simply one-sided and the good guys always are the good guys, right? It's how do we achieve our common goals is very much the aim of this story. So in the character realm, I would also just briefly tack on that there is a really lovely sapphic relationship through this story that you will completely get behind in the first book. It's kind of barely there. It's very much background. There's not really any romance to it. Like there's no steamy times, nothing like that. But it is present for sure. It's not, just leading you on. So there's definitely a little bit of a sapphic relationship there. In terms of kind of content-y warnings and spoiler stuff, I do want to mention. So content warnings, if you are not good with violence, this series is not for you. This is very violent. The first book, not as much. There's some graphic descriptions of magic going wrong, mainly, I think. There's definitely some violence there, but book 2, there's a very, very high amount of violence, very graphic on page. So be prepared going in. It gets pretty extremely gruesome. As I said, there's not really any significant sexual content at all through this series, so I don't think that's a concern for most people. In terms of spoilers that I do want to get into, I kind of already mentioned my catnip trope of the voices in heads, so that would be one. The other catnip trope for me that comes up here is a definite spoiler late into the series, and that spoiler is hive minds. Oh my gosh, there is so much cool stuff in terms of what's executed for hive minds here that I loved it. I was in heaven. In book 3, really, book 2 a bit, we're getting this concept of being able to connect people's minds. And so it starts there, but it just grows from there, and sort of we come to a point where there are characters who are multi-bodied, or they're a shared mind, many minds sharing many bodies, working at the same time. So it kind of reminds me of The Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge, where they have pack minds. They're these dog-like pack-minded aliens, and they can't imagine the concept of having individual bodies because each of these individual dogs is all sharing a single mind. And so to them, they're like appendages of the same body. And they're talking to these humans who don't understand that. And this feels like that at an even grander scale. These are really massive amounts of minds and bodies all commingled. And so the execution of that is just so cool, just really, really neat thing that I haven't seen done before in fantasy. So I think that's it for my spoilery stuff. In terms of just loving this series, I would implore you to go out and read it if any of this sounds at all interesting to you, because this was some of the most exciting fantasy that I've read in a really long time, in terms of just being totally swept up in the story and loving everything about what it has to say and how it's saying it. So definitely check out The Founders Trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett, and I know I will be watching out for whatever he does next. Thank you so much for watching BookTube, as always.